And we're back with more keywords and concepts. Now we're starting to move more into the history of the discipline of psychology and the ways in which psychology has been performed, right? The ways in which we've done psychology in the past. So this is in a very specific order, so I would make sure you pay attention to this order. So we started out with structuralism, and this was literally just us trying to figure out how our brains work. So, structuralism is focusing on the contents of mental processes rather than their actual function, right? So we're trying to figure out exactly how that structure in our brain is going on so that we can understand. It's very basic stuff, right? They're trying to figure out why do people um, listen to authorities or don't listen to authorities? Why are people doing the really basic stuff, right? Before we move into functionalism. Now, functionalism is more focused on how those mental activities that we were already interested in, things like learning and all of that, how that helped us fit into our environment, right? So, how we got to this point where our brains can do these things that helped us to be able to function in the world. And functionalists were more interested in the operation of the entire mind rather than parts, right? So with structuralism, we were still trying to figure out how do we learn? How do we see? How do we do things? With functionalism, it was how does all of that fit into being a human, right? How does that all go into that part? So that kind of takes us up until the early 20th century or so. And we get to behaviorism. Behaviorism is absolutely focused on behavior, right? So it's less about what's actually going on in your mind and more about the results of what go on, right? So they don't really care so much um, how your brain is functioning. They care how your brain is functioning and that makes you behave differently, right? So, a major object of study by behaviorists was learned behavior, and its interaction with our own inborn qualities, right? The things that make us human already, combined with what we learn in the world was behaviorism, right? And that was psychology for most of the 20th century before you move into humanism. And humanism kind of is the nicer version of behaviorism and the previous ones. It's a perspective within psychology that emphasizes the potential for good that we all have within us. So previous versions of psychology really kind of focused on what was wrong with us, like why didn't our brains work? Why weren't we smart? Why were people crazy? Humanism is more focused on the fact that all of us kind of had these building blocks to be the same decent human. How do we bring those out in everybody? So that's kind of the really quick basics. Obviously, this is all in your textbook for more detail. Moving on. We also have in this section the cognitive revolution, right? So that's happening in the 1950s, right around that switch, actually, where we're moving into starting to move a little bit more into humanism. But in the 1950s, there were a bunch of new disciplines coming out. So we were starting to have separate disciplines in linguistics and neuroscience and computer science, all of these kinds of things. And we were starting to connect these to the mind, to people, to how they behave, right? And it started to put us back into this idea of not just understanding why people do weird things or how they do the things that they do, but understanding the whole individual, understanding the entirety of the mind, which I know is a rather big concept. But that was the big cognitive revolution in the 1950s. We're trying to get away from Freud in the cognitive revolution. And then finally, in this section of history, is Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. Abraham Maslow was an American psychologist who is best known for proposing a hierarchy of human needs and motivating behavior. There's the lovely little pyramid thing in your textbook that you can go look at if you would like to. Basically, Maslow asserted that so long as your basic needs were met, like food, water, shelter, etc., your higher level needs, things like social needs, needs for acceptance, needs to get along with people, those needs would start to motivate your behavior. And we will go much more into this later in the term, but I just want you to be familiar with him at this point.